Piyush, before we begin, can I play a little icebreaker with you? Can I?
Yeah, you can play. It depends on what the nature of the icebreaker
Okay.
is.
So I will say two things, and you just decide. You just pick one. Okay, very quickly. Okay. Podcast mic or DJ booth?
Podcast mic.
Oh, not DJ booth. Okay. So matcha or coffee?
Coffee.
Apple or Android?
Apple.
Text message or voice notes?
Text message.
Okay. Citibank or DBS?
I have to say DBS. But it's a very close thing, by the way. I spent 28 years at Citibank.
We'll talk a little bit about that, right? The two girlfriends and an affair. Okay, so now last one. ChatGPT or DeepSeek?
I do perplexity actually.
Okay, I asked because we often put in inputs into ChatGPT or DeepSeek, and there's some bias there, right? So you get quite different answers. So I asked both about your leadership, and are you considered a good global leader? And guess what? Both of them said yes.
No bias.
So anyway, on that very cheeky note, congratulations on your recent appointment as the alternate member of the Council of Presidential Advisors. I know you recently had a long lunch with the President, and knowing that it's Chatham House rules here, so what would be your first piece of advice, solicited or unsolicited, that you would give out?
The Chatham House rules don't apply. When I was sworn in, the first oath you take is to pledge allegiance to the Constitution of Singapore. The second oath you take is sworn to secrecy, otherwise you're thrown into the jail with the Internal Security Act. But hypothetically, I'm not presumptuous to give Tharman advice. Tharman is very smart and he's very big. So, but speculative if I would, my one big thing is for Singapore overall, Tharman, I think we need to continue to be bold. Now, what do I mean by that? I think our first generation, 1960s, 70s, what really made Singapore stand out is we were contrarian, really bold. In a world of import substitution, we went for multinationals, export orientation. We created Jurong when nobody would have thought we had the right to be in petrochemicals, etc. But when you get big and you have a lot of money and you're very successful, then you automatically start getting more risk averse. But the problem is the world today is changing so rapidly and it's so dramatic, you can't afford to rest on your laurels. You really have to be bold. So I would say that. More generally in the context, I can tell you the one thing. When we did our review of some of these, the president is responsible for protecting the reserves. So we wind up reviewing many of the agencies. And one thing I did reflect on, I told him, I think we are in for a stagflationary world for a period of time. I think inflation will be sticky. I think growth will be somewhat slower. And in that environment, I think all old financial market correlations are suspect. Fixed income, equities, public markets. So I do think we should be, in the spirit of boldness, thinking of a bigger allocation to real assets and alternates. So whether it's gold, commodities, property, etc. And as you think of our asset allocation in the country, maybe we need to dial up some of that. So that's another thought I had.
Perfect, thank you. So speaking about being bold and risk-taking, so you had two girlfriends and one affair to date, right?
That's the known ones.
Yeah, that's the known ones. Okay, we shall grill you later after this. 28 years Citi, 16 years DBS, brief affair with a .com startup. So could you tell us a little bit about how that shaped you as a person, right? Having that brief affair.
Oh, the brief affair. So, I was mentioning outside, it was one of the roughest years of my life because I had quit. I was 40 years old when I quit Citi, and I went to set up this .com back in India and Delhi, and I had taken my kids out of school. I had 2 kids, and I was doing well at Citi. People regarded me well, and I went and joined it 1st of April 2000. And if those of you remember, Nasdaq crashed 2 weeks after I joined, right? And so 3 months into it, my funding dried up. My LP decided not to put money in. And I'd hired like 100 people. So I spent a long time trying to place the 100 out. And basically it was in shambles. I went through my first little bout of depression later in that year. It was not an easy time. And, I had the good news and the bad news. When I was quitting Citi, the CEO at that time, John Reed, he'd given me a safety net. He said, you go with my blessings. If it doesn't work out, you come back. Now, that's a double-edged sword. Double-edged sword is the confidence because you can't fundamentally go too wrong. But it also means that you don't have the tenacity and that you get if you don't have options. So sometimes I say, the best thing to do is not to have options, then you don't have a choice. So I went back to banking, I went back to Citibank on day 364, and I didn't do badly, as you know. But in hindsight, I started 4 companies in that 6-8 month period. About a dozen years later, 2 of those 4 companies became unicorns. So if I'd had the strength to stick around, I would have spawned 2 unicorns out of my original startup. That wouldn't have been a bad thing. Anyway, I've said before, I learned 2 things from my .com stint, which I didn't appreciate then, I appreciated many years later. The first was my capacity to take risk increased a lot. And increased a lot because, once you've really seen the worst, you've seen the bottom of the barrel, you start with the mindset of saying, how much worse can it get? So you look at some of the biggest entrepreneurs, biggest successes are not the people who did really well and got the best grades and so on, right? They're the people who actually didn't do well and didn't have a choice. And so you have to go into business and start your own thing, right? Because they didn't have too many other choices. I think there's some truism to that, when you've really seen and scaled the bottom of the barrel, the capacity to take risk increases. The other learning to me, which is more apposite and appropriate for this conversation, so till my late 30s, my guiding principle for all the stuff, like everybody, used to be career success. I wanted to be the youngest managing director in the bank. I wanted to, get to make country manager and, be on the fast track. And that is what drove a lot of my actions. When I came back to banking, it was, after many months of reflection and depression, the reason I went back to banking was very different. I said, you know what, I'm a good banker. I enjoy banking. And the more I thought about it, I said, I can make a difference in banking. I can make impact. And so I came back with a completely different mindset. And that mindset was a mindset driven by purpose and impact. And the easy way to think about it is, before then, I'd moved 5 times in 5 years in the pursuit of my career. And I used to keep taking my kids out of school. And so I went from Singapore to Indonesia to Delhi to Hong Kong to Malaysia, all 5 years. By then, my daughter was 14, going into high school. And I said, you know what, I'm not moving. So a couple of years in, the bank tried very hard to move me out of Malaysia because they wanted to promote me. And I kept turning it down. I said, I've got to align my... and frankly, it turned out to be okay. Sometimes I wound up learning how to do consumer banking, which I did, and that helped me eventually become the DBS head. But this whole notion of being driven by impact and purpose came to me after the .com stint.
So talking about this, your season of impactful leadership at DBS, was it very difficult to leave behind? So what made you leave and decide that was the right time to retire?
Oh, so it wasn't difficult at all. Not because, I loved DBS and I was doing well and everybody loved me. But I think, this idea of purpose is not just purpose around the job. You've got to have a purpose for your life. When early in 2010, I was engaged with trying to figure we need to have clarity of purpose for DBS and define the soul of DBS. And so we got hold of this institute called the Authentic Leadership Institute. They're a part of Harvard. And so I brought them down for 2 days at Sentosa and we talked, and I wanted them to help us shape collectively for 20 of us what should DBS's purpose be. And they spent the morning actually starting with us and saying, let's try and define your individual purpose and see if we can get alignment. And at this stage, after you got to come up with a good phrase. So I was thinking, but the phrase defined it well for me. I said my purpose is really to help shape tomorrow's world. And it's architected on what I think my strengths are. I think I'm quite strategic. I can form a big picture view. I can form an assessment of where I think things might be going. But also I know how to translate that into action. I'm good at creating programs of change. And so based on that, I figured that, given all the change that's happening, that's my purpose, to help shape tomorrow's world. Now, when you start with that purpose, then you're going to figure you live once in your life, right? I've done a lot in banking and finances. There has to be more to your purpose than only banking and finance. And so in COVID, in I think 2020, there was this WhatsApp going around, which I don't know if it's true or apocryphal, but it was supposedly this Australian nurse who was interviewing a lot of people on their deathbed. And she said that the biggest thing people said is the regrets they had, is the things they wanted to do and they never did. And that's stuck with me. When I was a kid and growing up, I had all these kinds of things. I will do this, I'll do that. And I said, I can spend my whole life working at DBS, and then, I'll die saying I was a great banker, but what are the other things I could have done, and, how would I live my purpose? So I figured that 65 was a good day to say, okay, I'm going to, pursue other interests and others. So you live only once. When you get to the 60s, joking about this, I can tell you get to the 60s, the biggest premium is time. You don't know when you're going to cop it. You don't know how much time you have. And so you have to be very mentally disciplined, saying, okay, in the time that I have, what do I want to do with that time? And so I was quite thoughtful. I said, I do have a lot of passion for two things, nature and education. I really think helping shape tomorrow's world, the problems of the planet are very real in my mind. And I like, conservation and biodiversity. So I said, I've got to find some time to devote to that because it's a large part of what interests and defines me. And education I've always been interested in because I think the biggest impact you can make is actually working and helping people educate. So I said I've got to find time to do these two things. And then on top of that, I also am quite rooted in Anchorage. I go to find time to make sure I have time for my family and my grandkids and friends and travel and all that kind of stuff. So long answer that I went and told the board I'm done at 65. The board spent the whole day trying to talk me out of it. Everybody's working till 70, 75. This is really quite determined at 65. But I gave them 3 years not them, us collectively 3 years to plan for a transition.
They didn't give you a safety net, did they?
The board didn't give me a safety net.
Okay. So, look, I don't think any panel discussion can go ahead without AI and the mention of AI, and you recently talked about it in your speech as well, to leapfrog with technology and with AI, right? So what does it mean to do this and yet retain humanity, right? Humanity, as leaders, especially during a very difficult time when AI seems to be smarter than most of us in this room. Maybe not you, but...
Not me also. Frankly, I think this is the toughest question and challenge. There's a part of me which, like everybody, appreciates the power of AI. It's unbelievable what you can do. You press one button and everything like this, right? And at DBS, we started dabbling with AI a long time ago, 2012, when IBM came up with Watson. We were the global pilot for IBM Watson for wealth management. Then 2014, I set up a lab with A-Star. They gave us 4 data scientists. We put 7, 8 of our people. We ran a 3-year lab and we learned how to do AI. 2016, we invested in about 10% of an AI company in New York called Kai. So the point I'm making, a long time ago, we figured the power of data and the power of AI. And we started measuring our delta from AI at DBS. And this year, DBS will make over $1 billion, $1.2 billion of economic value from the old AI, predictive AI, not even Gen AI, predictive AI. So it's immensely powerful. So you have to want to do that. The problem is the other part of me is also sometimes can be quite dystopian because it is quite scary to me in the future. What does it mean for jobs? What does it mean for the nature of us as people? What does it mean for, the difference between us and robots? Privacy. Are we losing agency? Where do you wind up with? Do you really get to a world where machines, can run artificial general intelligence? They could run everything, right? Now, some of it you can figure is in the realms of science fiction, but already I can tell you, jobs are at risk. A year ago, I went on record saying I think DBS will have 4,000 fewer people in 3 years than they do today. And I got hammered. The minister started calling me the next day saying, why are you panicking everybody? This is, you can sweep it under the carpet, but it is true that jobs are going to be redefined and restructured. So it's not, all positive thing. So the problem when I say it's a tough choice, one of my ex-chairman, Chuck Prince, he once said in the context of subprime, that the problem is when you're a business leader, when the music is playing, you have to get on the dance floor. I would have done DBS a disservice if I had not gone down the AI path, if we had not created the 1 billion economic value, if we had not done that. That's my job, I've got to do it. So one of the things that I've been pushing is this idea of humanity. You got to be able to make sure that the data you use, the models you use are purposeful. And so we came up, and one of my guys, my colleagues came up with this idea of the PURE committee. PURE stands for purposeful, unsurprising, respectful, and explainable, PURE. And the idea is that, if you're going to run a model or use data, one, it must be purposeful. You've got to be able to demonstrate on balance it is going to do good for your customers. Right? Second, it must be unsurprising. The customer shouldn't be surprising, hey, where did you get this from? And you were not supposed to have it. It should be respectful, there's got to be some respect for customer agency. And every model that we create, the 350 model, the 1600 models, 350 use cases, everything goes to the committee to say, does it, meet the intuition of this is a good thing to do, as opposed to this is a bad thing to do. After having said all that, I still worry that, is it really going to be good for everybody? My biggest worry around data, for example, it can upend us as our behaviors as people. My favorite example is insurance. If you think about the insurance industry, it exists on a simple premise that nobody knows where the risk is. And so it's like a kitty. We all put in money as premiums so that if somebody gets hit by cancer or something, they get to take the kitty away, right? And because nobody knows. Now with data and AI, if everybody knows, right, that you're going to get cancer and not going to get cancer, I can tell you nobody wants to insure you, and I don't want the insurance because I know I'll never get cancer. So end of industry, because the minute you have too much knowledge, too much information, and too much AI, what does it mean to us now? Then it goes back to, as society, do we still want to socialize and share the risk or not? When you know, that goes to questions of philosophy. What makes us people? Why do we work together? So my view, long answer, the biggest challenges as mankind and business leaders in the coming decade will not be challenges of STEM, of science technology. There will be challenges of philosophy and ethics. What is the right thing to do? What should we do? And these are very subtle. The liberal arts kind of question.
Absolutely, very fascinating. So maybe we change gears a little bit, because there's a lot of board members, aspiring board members, and directors in the room as well, as executives. So could you talk a little bit about the changing role of management versus board, especially in today's very turbulent, uncertain world, with a need for long-term versus short-term gains, elbow room for management? What do you think?
So again, getting harder. First, I want to point out something. People, this first issue goes to the stakeholder and shareholder debate, right? And people think that historically the boards have all been focused on shareholder and shareholder returns, and there is a transition, which there is, or was till a year ago, towards a greater stakeholder awareness among boards. I always hasten to point out that this was a 25-year phenomenon. If you look at the origin of boards, in 18th century UK, the merchant guilds, boards were charged with running companies, right? And you collectively got together and ran companies, which means you had responsibility for strategy and direction. In truth, I think that's always been recognized, the board role of a board. Boards run companies, right? And therefore your role is not just a policing function, governance function. You have a function to create value for shareholders, and in the past, create value and appropriate value for multiple stakeholders. That is the role traditionally of a board. Then what happened in the 1970s, when Friedman wrote his famous doctrine in the New York Times, he made a really compelling case that actually boards should not have this multiple responsibility to a lot of people. They should only be responsible to the shareholder. And a lot of people have criticized him, but Friedman's point was very simple, as telling people outside the room. His point was, if you have given me $100 to invest, I go and invest and I earn $10, right? Now, I could take the $10 and say, I'm not going to take 5 of this and give it to my favorite charity. I'm going to give 2 of it to do good, $1 for whatever. And Friedman's point was, you have no right to do that. You better return the $10 to the person who gave you the money and let that person decide if they want to give it to a charity, what charity, greens. It is the shareholder's right to do what they want with the money. It's not management's right. to make that choice. So you can understand his logic, right? I mean, agency management should not have agency around it. Now, I've always believed that the flaw in Friedman's logic is that when you create companies, especially, companies are given legal status. It becomes a living entity, right? And it gets rights. It gets rights because you can't sue the management because it's a legal protection you get as a company corporate. Now, if you get rights, then you must have responsibilities. And those responsibilities must include responsibility to civic society, to community. You got to go to first principles. You get a license from civil society to serve a purpose. You cannot ignore that. So my bias has always been on the stakeholder side, that you have to be thoughtful about why do you exist, what is your purpose, and how do you address multiple things. Right? Now, if you look at the transition for the 2019, when the Business Roundtable, the top 100 CEOs in the US all signed up to this transition from shareholder to stakeholder to the big step. Except that in the last 12 months, they've all quietly forgotten there. And they all, after Trump came, nobody's like, many of them are not pursuing it. So it tells you how much they genuinely believed it. But to me, that role, which is that boards actually have a role to multiple stakeholders, you're going to see more and more of that. You're going to see more of that because the public at large will expect that. They will increasingly ask, what purpose are you serving? Why do you exist? You can see with all these Gen Z protests going on in country after country. Right now it's targeted at government and policy officials. It will also be directed at companies, I mean, you're not just here to make money. What are you trying to do? So I think boards will transition to do that. But there's a second issue which is also challenging. I'm of the view that, see, this notion that so boards have to obviously do governance. If you argue that they have to have a strategic this thing of being able to figure, some strategy, I think the boards have to do more than that, and that's also a shift. So I think this idea of being clear about purpose, that's a board agenda. It's not just, why do you exist? What are you trying to do? I think it's a board agenda. I think not only strategy, but culture is a board agenda. What is the soul of your company? What do you want to be? What is the way of, I think that's a board agenda. And increasingly, I believe in tomorrow's world, competitive advantage is going to come from how do you operate? The companies which win will be adaptable, nimble, and operate quite differently because change is so exponential. You have to build the capacity in the company to be able to respond. So building that kind of capacity, how do you operate, is also quasi-board agenda. So I think the role of a board is actually getting and will be more expanded to be able to at least weigh in on these big questions. Now this raises a fundamental problem. If the board starts weighing in these questions, then how do you demarcate between the role of the board and the role of management? Right? And so how do you make sure the board is not micromanaging? How do you give enough room and elbow room to management to get on and do what it needs to do? And that's an art form. One of my biggest positives in my DPS stint is I had a fantastic board and a great chairman, and we got along well. So we had a lot of alignment. We used to fight all the time in the board because we were a very active and vociferous board. But I engaged the board all along. To me, there were 10 free consultants. Right? So I engaged the board as partners in helping me and collectively think about these things. I brought them to the board saying, this is purpose, what kind of culture, what kind of risk appetite. So I never wanted a situation where the board said, hey, we didn't know what was going on. And they represent the shareholder, they must know. In return, my board and chairman are very clear. They would, discuss this with me, and then after that, they would just give us the elbow room to go and operate. They didn't get into micromanaging. So I think it can be done, but it is an art form. To be able to be engaged at this level of driving purpose, culture, strategy, without getting into the day-to-day management of all of this stuff, because then you crowd the management out.
So you're saying that you have good relationship with the board, is what you're saying, and then bring them along on the journey, keeping them updated. Anything else that you can dive deeper into this art form?
The first thing is you better have a great relationship with the chairman. I think, in the US, as you know, the CEOs are chairman, right? But the European model and our model in most parts of the world is you have a split between chairman and CEO, and I think that's very good because that allows for a level of independence. But I've also found, and certainly in my case, that if you have a good chairman and you have good alignment with the chairman, the chairman can manage the board for you. Right? In my case, I had 10, 11 board members. And if I had 11 bosses and you try and manage 11 people, you're dead, right? If 4 of them are one view, 4 of another view, what do you do? So you can leverage the chairman quite well to be able to do that. And that's one. The second is this thing about being open kimono. So in my first board meeting, the early board, I was talking about DBS had lost a lot of money in the Middle East. They'd written off in '09 and '08, '09, almost $2 billion. And I made the observation that, DBS is supposed to be an Asian bank. What the hell were we doing lending in Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia? And two board members said, oh, we never knew, right? I was stunned because, how can the board say we did not know, right, that we had big exposures in the Middle East? So I told myself and my senior management team, we will never be in a situation where the board ever says we did not know. Now, and that means you've got to be quite thoughtful because you can always point to the board saying, hey, we reported. Yeah, you give them a 1,000-page deck and it's on page 346, no board member ever reads a 1,000-page deck. It's impossible. So then you have to lean in simple language to tell the board you need to know this. You need to understand this. Because if you don't know and understand this, you'll miss the big picture. So I spent a lot of time simplifying and telling the board that this is what you should know, this is what you should think about, this is the risk that I'm taking, and you've got to be comfortable with the risk I'm taking. So the second thing. The third thing is I genuinely believe the boards are great consultants. You've got 10, 12 people who've got wisdom, they've been around. So how do you create a channel where your leadership and your team have the capacity to reach out to the board for this consulting without creating a situation where you have 10 bosses giving different instructions, right? So again, I said, I'm not going to be a gatekeeper. I want the board to be able to feel to reach out. I want my people to reach out to the board. But I also told the board, finally, I'm the boss. If you start giving instructions to my people, then we can't have 11 people driving the bus. And that, because we had honest conversations about this early, it worked out quite well. They would give advice, but finally they said, you'll find decision as the CEO. He can decide what he wants to do. So I think managing people is acquired skill, and people don't think about it hard enough. How do you build that muscle to manage people? I tell people very early that the kind of experiences you need to try and get along the way. You must try and get people management experience. They start with managing 2 people and then go to 4 people and 8 people, etc. You must try and get geographic experience because cultures matter. So you need to understand how people operate in different environments. And you must get domain experience because having some knowledge of what's going on in different domains is very helpful to connect the dots. So my first thing is think very hard because managing people, think about the whole performance cycle. So how do you set good goals? How do you actually coach people to be able to achieve those goals? How do you actually learn to have honest conversations so you can, either motivate or this thing? How do you fire people? Right? I've fired so many people in my life, and by and large, even after I fire people, they're still my friends and they still call me for career advice. So you got to have a knack of knowing how to fire people and let people go. You got to have the interest. So it's an acquired skill. I did one of the best courses I ever did was in my first couple of years, and it's called Developing Management Skills. And it teaches you each of these areas, how do you go about it, and I internalized it. So that's one big thing to be able to do. The second thing is, the role of a boss, as you get big, I define it in 2 ways. One is you have to be a troubleshooter. Troubleshooter means your job is to make your people's job easy. If you start figuring how do I work to make job easy for your people, they'll be able to perform well. So I always think of my role as an inverted pyramid. And everybody puts the boss on top and down. I always think of it the reverse. The boss is at the bottom. And the boss is at the bottom. Your job is to figure how do you make the layer above you more productive. That's what your job needs to be. So you got to troubleshoot for them. And the second thing you got to figure is you got to give them air cover. Right? So that's the second critical thing for a boss. Things will go wrong, people will mess up. If every time you sort of land it on your people, they'll never work. Right? People are entrepreneurial and produce the best outcomes when they have the psychological safety thing. It's okay to take some risks. It's okay to make a few mistakes because then they will experiment and try. But that means that you have to provide air cover. Right? So I'll give an example. When in 2021 we had a technology outage, right? So we got some consultants to look at it and think that we thought we'd fixed it. 2023 we had FOMO. And when we had FOMO technology, I realized there were some more fundamental issues that we needed to go and address. So without getting into the details, the big thing was both the regulator and the board got really antsy. And they started pushing, saying, oh, we need to find the people, we need to figure who did the job properly, and so on. And I said to myself, look, as far as everybody is concerned, this is my responsibility, me and the senior team, by the way. So we said, yes, if somebody wants to take punitive action and punish things, you punish the CEO, or punish the management. Beyond that, I'm not letting anybody. Now, that doesn't mean I don't met. It's my job. I work with the people. I pointed out things that we could do better, etc., etc. But the fact that I'm prepared to give air cover, saying the buck stops with me, that gives so much confidence to the people, saying we can stretch and we can do stuff. So once I do that, learn the art of people management, but think of your job as troubleshooting and giving a cover.
Okay, while waiting, Piyush, which course did you take in developing management skills? Was it in SMU?
Well, I don't know whether we have one in SMU. If not, we should create one. But I actually then taught this course, and I used to do the 5-day program I used to teach. And then on Wednesday evening, I used to do the bootleg version. So this was about development. Then I used to take people for a drink at night. And then I said, okay, forget the course. I'll tell you how really you should be doing this. And that's when I came up with this thing on networking. How do you network? Coattailing, which is today politely you say, how do you find the right mentor? I should say, how do you find coattails to hang on to? Taking a risk on your career. How do you actually choose the right risk? And how do you actually use the grapevine? So I should give them the. Now this is wrong in the days when I was still focused on how do you build careers, and before I got focused on how do you make impact. And that's a very simple investment anybody can make, and nobody does, which is read. So my biggest advice to people is read, for God's sake. Everybody has done anything you want to do, somebody's done. It's written. In the old days, you have to go to the library. Now you just Google. You go on the internet. But read. So, if you're not spending enough time reading, you're missing the single biggest investment you can make. Ideas don't come in a vacuum. You come up and say, okay, let's do one. It doesn't just come. It comes from reading and talking to people. You can obviously talk to people. When I'm CEO, I'm very easy. Right? Every consultant wants to come and pitch business. So I talk to everybody, McKinsey, NBA, and BCG, and you get ideas from them. But self-driven, you have to read. I used to read, I read McKinsey's books, I read Harvard Business Review. So by reading a lot of stuff about what's happening in other industries, what's going on, that's when you start forming ideas and learning. And so I also had a second thing of I've talked about it. I split the urgent from the important. So all of us, in your daytime, especially all of you are busy executives, right? You're busy, and because you're busy with your intake. Because like it or not, your boss wants something, your people want something, customer wants something. You don't have a choice. You got to keep responding, and you got KPIs and so on. That's what I call the urgent. So you have to handle the urgent because that's your job. But the important stuff, my personal thing, I don't recommend it to everybody. I used to park, so I'd always leave it unread in the email or move it to another file. Or when I'd block out 2 or 3 hours of the weekend and on my travels to read and think about the important stuff. Because that requires quiet time, that requires reflection time. Saying, what are they saying? Does it make sense to me? What could I do? And I sort of always took a 3 hour stint every weekend, and I'd find some, not a fix, to spend 3 hours thinking about the important things. And that links back to reading. So if you read about stuff, somebody sent you things, you start thinking about it, then you form ideas. So it's hard, and finally, if it's really, see, at the margin, all of us make compromises. Yeah. So you don't want to stand on a high horse with an inconsequential thing you want. If it's a big enough issue, then finally you got to be prepared to fall on your sword and say, look, this is just a non-starter. But it goes back to this discussion of engaging the board on purpose. So I'm a big believer in having clarity of purpose, both for the board and for the management team. We spend, I'll come back to your question, but let me give, when I was trying to do this, what is our purpose? I talked about individual purpose. We finally kept going back to, so what should DPS's purpose be? And we wanted, cool sounding thing like Microsoft or Google or connect the world, something like sexy stuff. But we kept coming back to, banking is a great industry. It's a really meaningful industry. It helps people save, it helps people buy their first home, it helps, there's a lot of good things. The world would not be what it is today without the financial services sector. So we persuaded ourselves that actually, to be a good bank is a good purpose. But we said, what is the problem? The biggest problem with that is banking is inefficient. You got to take half a day off to go and do your bank work because it's not easy to do. And somebody showed us some research that said 74% of people prefer going to a dentist rather than going to the bank. And you don't feel very good about your job that way. Right? But then we kicked it around, and one of my colleagues came up with this idea that, if you could make banking joyful, a joy to be a bank, that would be a fantastic purpose. And even though we laughed at him first and we kicked him out of the room, we kept coming back to that idea. If you could make banking joyful, it would be a great purpose. And that's funny, that's what the purpose statement of DBS is, to make banking joyful. Now, once you define that, then a lot of, it gives you two paths. One, everybody knows what's okay to do. For me, this idea of making banking joyful and being, therefore, truly customer obsessed, it liberated the thinking of our people. All our people figured, as long as I could demonstrate that this is making banking joyful, I have the freedom to go ahead and do things. It created energy. But it also does another very important thing. It defines OB markers. It defines, what should you not be doing, right? And so if a good purpose statement helps you define OB markers, and when it does that, it says this is what we can't do, then it allows you to empower people. Because, broadly, they understand the OB markers. So I found the same thing with the board. I spent a long 2-day session with the board teasing out this kind of stuff. Right? And the biggest, I'll give examples of what we're trying to do, why this is our purpose statement. By and large, the board is aligned. Our biggest pushback came when we decided in our third way to embrace sustainability. So, a few people on the board were of this thing that, the sustainability will compromise a lot of profit if we start focusing too much on climate, etc., etc. And so it took us a lot of time first to make sure people understand that there is really no contradiction. Yes, there might be a timing issue, but we also were able to then work with people saying we can focus on sustainability without actually giving a profit. In fact, there are opportunities with sustainability which can help us increase and increment profit. So we can actually reconcile the two. So if you have clarity and purpose, you can get there. But like I said, you can still get to a situation, like you said, where some director says, look, all of this is not important. We just make money and ethics be damned. And then you got to figure you're prepared to force the issue at a stage or not, right? And I always felt that if you have a good, interactive, honest board, then you should debate these issues. Like I said, our board was, new board members used to come and they used to be shocked by, we never had a rubber stamp board. We used to argue and debate vociferously on these kinds of issues only, right? But to me, if you air it out, you express different points of view and drive the conversations, by and large you get to the right place. So when I started 2014, when we decided to go all in on tech and digital, I got McKinsey to go and bring me the org charts of the global companies, and they showed me Google's org chart. Now some of it is semantics, but the way they showed it to me stunned me. So most companies, you have a lot of business heads and one CIO, right? So the chief information officer. Google's org chart they showed me had 10 CIOs and one business head. Right? The only business head was the head of sales and marketing. The head of Chrome was called CIO. The head of search was called CIO. The head of each one of these. Why? Because they were CTOs but had product management responsibilities. So they were tech and product. And I was really struck by the fact that for Google, obviously, technology is the business. Right? And what is it? You're creating technology products. But then when you start reflecting on it, that's true for every company. And my example I use, Uber a car company or a tech company? Is Airbnb a hotel company or a tech company? Every company is a tech company. So then you got to go back and say product creation and business creation, you have to believe that in today's world, everything is going to be anchored off tech, which means that you got to think of technology not just as a back office support function. You have to think of them as a partner in shaping the business. I basically said you cannot be the conductor in the bus, you must be a co-driver of the bus. Right? Now, how do you make tech a co-driver of the bus? And that's where we came up with the two in a box, saying we converted to 30 odd platforms. And so every platform said there must be two leads, one tech lead and one business lead, and they've got to share KPIs. That means the tech person must understand market share, profitability, business, and the business person must understand cycle time, downtime, resiliency, and so on, and because they've got to share KPIs. And so we came up with this two in a box idea. The biggest challenge of that was, what the challenge, apart from educating both sides, was that the business people are always talk better and are more senior. The tech people have less confidence and they tend to be more junior. So, so they always listen. They were used to getting direction from the business person, right? So you have to rebalance that, change some tech people, make more senior people, give them some power and so on. But in truth, it's more than tech and business. And in 2017, when we got into this tech to business, I chickened out because I was looking at agile at scale. I saw that the best performing companies actually run virtual teams of all the people who are relevant to a particular product line or business or whatever working together in a virtual team. And I'd seen the power of this. We go back to even in 1970 when Volvo was making cars. Volvo was the first company which, instead of making cars on an assembly line, I mean, everybody just does the little thing. One person puts the wheel, one puts the screw. But Volvo made a team of 10, 12 people to make the whole car. And so they had small teams of 12 making cars. And you get much better cars, but the problem is it's not scalable, right? And so you give up too much in efficiency. And by 2000, the tech companies figured that with today's collaboration tools, workflow engines and virtualization and so on, you can actually make virtual teams without giving up efficiency. And so that launched the whole agile at scale thing, that you get agile teams without. So in 2017, the consultants were pushing me to actually adopt agile at scale. But when I went and looked at some companies which are doing agile at scale, it just seemed to me it's quite confusing. You have these scrums and tribes, and as a reason the company will go crazy, right? It's like I Mickey Mouse and say, okay, let's do two in a box. At least put tech and business together. But by 2020, 21, we were confident enough to actually adopt agile at scale. So we call it managing through journeys at DBS. And so the whole company is now allocated into platforms. So everyone is part of a virtual team. So M1 to M4, you get a tag, either full time or across location and so on. And so the virtual team today share complete KPIs, whether you're in operations or compliance or risk management or tech, you're all part of a virtual team. And your KPIs, your performance evaluation, your incentives are all team focused across everybody. And that makes a profound difference, because if you're an operations person, a compliance person, you're not just guarding the win. You're actually part of delivering a customer outcome. So we've gone from two in a box now to agile at scale. I think it's not easy to do. You've got to change the performance management system. You've got to change the actual reward recognition system. But if you can get there, the outcomes are dramatic. Well, that's true. We actually industrialize innovation. So look at, how do you actually, like 3M. 3M had this big mantra of 30% of your revenues had to come from new products. And so we didn't get to 30%, but this idea of that you've got to be able to industrialize innovation was part of what we were trying to do. And we industrialized it by creating an innovation pyramid. So we innovated at 4 levels. At the bottom was the old suggestion box kind of thing. So we crowdsourced ideas from people. And every time we got crowdsourced ideas, we gave the platform teams the ability, we gave them some money to put those ideas. And then we put it into the second level is the journey level, the third level is the platform level. But at the top of the house, we'd meet every 6 months. And we met every 6 months. We had a small research team. They would give us the ideas of what are the big things happening around the world. And we'd collectively, as a team, reflect on, is this something that we're willing to make some bets on? So around that time, I think 2018 or something, the team started really talking a lot about tokenization and crypto. And that, this is going to, and so we kicked it around and said, the fact that tokenization is likely to happen, I think it's a given. Value follows technology. It used to be cowrie shares, then it went to metal, then it went to paper, then it went to plastic. So it is logical that value will get tokenized. It is so convenient. Then the thing was, so what would a bank do in that? And we came up with the notion we should learn how to tokenize any asset class, fixed income, equities, property. We should have a trading platform to be able to trade that asset class. We should have a digital custody to be able to custodize that asset class. And we should have the capacity to on-ramp and off-ramp so we can make some money doing that. And so when we said, okay, let's do all of this stuff, we created a small team. And you got to figure sometimes, it was a lot of money, $5-10 million, and given we make $20 billion. So we created a small team and said, okay, we'll experiment and see what happens. The team came back to me very quickly and said, you want to tokenize fixed income and property, nothing is going to work. The only thing there's liquidity in is Bitcoin and Ethereum. So if you really want to go this route, then we have to be prepared to get liquidity from Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then we can learn how to do the other stuff. So again, it's a manageable bet. We didn't bet the farm. So I said, okay, as long as we can ring fence it, manageable bet, let's start doing. So we took 4 coins first and said, okay, let's start trading. Actually, it's a funny story. My best investment in the last 3 years is I bought 5 Bitcoin. The reason I bought 5 Bitcoin is because the team told me that they're going to get this trading capability exchange ready. And then I went that Friday and it wasn't ready. Then they said, no, come after 2 weeks. I went after 2 weeks, still not ready. Then I lost my temper. I said, I'm coming after 2 weeks, you better be ready because I'm going to buy. So then they got it ready, then I have to buy it. So I bought 5 coins, and then after it doubled or tripled, I sold 2 coins, so my other 3 coins are free. Just keep it up. But so it goes back to the underlying thing, that the capacity to innovate comes from the willingness to take some risk, but you have to be able to have OB markers that curtail risk. So I went to MAS and said, this is what I want to do. The MAS's biggest concern was don't take it to the retail market. Even that I pushed them, because I said, what, every year, DBS was by then losing $1 billion in deposits. All the kids were taking money out of us and going to Gemini exchange platform, something to buy crypto. I said, they're already doing it, for God's sake, you let them do it for me, at least I'll put some, but they won't let me do it. So we agreed that I would keep it focused on institutional investors and the accredited investors. But that's okay. That gives you the ability to learn, to get on and do some stuff. So that is how we got. But it's not the only time. We pushed the envelope in many ways, but we took calibrated bets. And some of them didn't work out. Some of them, the bet on tokenizing cryptos worked out really well. Right? So I think the future of education is, and going back to the earlier AI discussion, I think this is going to be one of our big challenges. Where do the future jobs come from in a world of AI and Gen AI? My big worry is that the premium on domain knowledge is going to be lower and lower. Why? You ask ChatGPT anything, right? And you press a button, it'll give you 2 good paras, and if you can, have read and this thing, in 10 minutes you can master 2 pages, as much as anybody else does. Right? I went to see a doctor the other day, and like everybody, I put it in this thing and got a response. The doctor thought I was a doctor. He said, you're Dr. Gupta. I said, actually, I'm not, but I already, ChatGPT told me as much as the doctor was able to tell me, right? So domain knowledge is going to be easy to get. So then what do you need? I think we have to go back to this idea of getting horizontal skills. What will make the difference are people who know how to connect the dots, to understand context, to be able to think about the philosophy, the ethics. I think that's what we need to train and skill people for. And so increasingly at SMU, we're trying to do that. The integrated study program, the ability to pick and choose your own major, driving a lot of this, and then learning by doing. I think entrepreneurship is going to be a big agenda. So we're trying to get our students at every level that you must intern, get entrepreneurship, do more startups. So my view is that's the nature of education that you need. And therefore SMU is already doing it. It's not new to me. Is when you look at people you want to bring in, I think just focusing on the GPA and figuring, what do you do in your A-levels or this thing, it's not adequate. By the way, I did that in DBS as well. So I know you're running out of time, but I'll tell you the story and there's a parallel. So when I joined DBS, the hiring criteria used to only be that you went to NUS and you took the first honors from accounting and finance or something. So I asked them, why do you do this? They said, we get 80,000 applications, we go to shortlist. So the only way to shortlist is to go and look at the GPA and take the top. I said, that's crazy. To shortlist, how does it matter? You don't take the top 20, take the next 20, still a shortlist, right? Take the bottom 20, still a shortlist. In my experience, the best bankers are never the top of the class. right? Because to be good bankers, you need to have not just good academic things, you need to have street smarts, you need to be good with people, you need to have good packaging. And in fact, I told them that I was never top in my class. If I went by your criteria, I would never have become a banker. Right? So just for protecting people like me, can you change the criteria? But we changed the criteria. So our hiring in DPS got more skills focused as opposed to grade focused. And SMU has also done the same thing. The hiring is not just grade focused, it is a holistic evaluation. The interview, SMU is the one that got to interview everybody. And we interview everybody to try and figure what is the right blend of people and then how do you work with them to go forward. I think this is what we're going to have to do, both in terms of the input, but also how do you polish and create the output. We're just going to have to do more of that. My associate as SMU has not been long. I've been chairman for 3 years, and as a hirer though, as an employer, it's always been quite clear that the SMU students are different, and I think that's because KP, the chairman for first generation, they focus so much on this idea of pedagogy, small class size, entrepreneurship, internship, foreign exposure. So I think that's what defines the difference, just the confidence in the packaging. We just have to double down more on that because I think that is what the world is going to look for as you go forward.
If you could issue a challenge, right, or a thought-provoking way to live and work, in the current climate, to a room full of leaders with the capacity to change the world, right, what would it be?
I think to have clarity of purpose of what you want to do with yourself in your life. Right. So how do you leave the world a better place than you inherited? How do you leave the job? I mean, what are the footprints you want to leave in the sands of time? You've got to be thoughtful about that. And I know it's not always easy, everybody's not senior enough, you're not CEO, but irrespective of what. My short is, even when you join as a management trainee or associate at people, I can make out in the first 6 months who's going to be a superstar. Right? And I look for this, you might have seen the 5 I's, right? Do you have individual accountability, initiative, innovation, inspiration, intent? But of that, this whole idea of looking for people who are driven by making a difference. You can figure out the people who are trying to make a difference, to make change, to make an impact. So at the junior most level, I tell people that 90% of your job your boss will tell you. 10%, for God's sake, take your time to figure out what are you doing? What is your agenda? What do you want to leave this place better than you found? So my biggest thing to all of you is that you think about what is the footprints you want to leave on your job, in your circumstance, in your community, and your time. And if you can get that right, you will make a difference.
Well, on the note, ladies and gentlemen, lead with purpose, our very first panel discussion, right on message, and lead with purpose in your life and in your companies. So thank you very much.